来听一下英文的，一二三，一二三，一二三，一二三，一二三，一二三，一二三。活动开始，活动开始，活动预备，预备，活动预备。
对，但是你要翻成英文吗？啊，玉美来就好了啦。对，三乘3乘6， 没有，我们只是示范给大家看，就是现场可以先。
有一个秀的。
对，OK 的。
这个还是 OK 的。
对，
因为大家可以扫出来。
谢谢。
可是可以远端扫 QR code。
嗯。
你秀左边那个。
这个吗？
对啊，这个 QR code 就是了。
好。
所以你对，你按这个。对。
懂。
他坐在座位上扫就直接到这里。
可以。
好，OK，谢谢。
那玉梅在哪？哦，好啊，可以啊。 扫这个 QR code。
OK。我知道。活动即将于10分钟后开始。那在场的观众呢，你们可以先扫荧幕上你们右手边荧幕上的 QR code， 可以登录 Slido 平台。那进入网页之后呢，输入活动代码3×3×6，就可以进入本次活动的提问页面。那注意那个乘是小写的英文 X。Please log on to www.sli.do and enter event code 3×3×6. Click on Join. You may pose questions instantly during the talk on Slido platform. You may also scan the QR code on your right-hand side on the screen. 不好意思，现场的观众，那我们再等5分钟，等更多人陆续就座。The talk will start in 5 minutes, while we are waiting for more audience to join us. 那在这个同时，跟晚来的观众宣达一下，就是在荧幕右手边有一个 QR code， 可以扫描就可以进入我们的 Slido 线上提问平台。You may scan the QR code on the right-hand side of the screen to enter the Slido platform to pose questions. Remember to enter 3 times 3 times 6 for entering the event page. 请各位扫描之后呢，输入3×3×6即可进入问题的提问页面。
再换回来就好。
已经有人问了，那我要开始了。各位朋友，大家好，欢迎来到2019年第58届威尼斯国际美术双年展台湾馆展览座谈。转型中的民主，第4次工业革命中的自由、艺术与合作行动，郑淑丽、保罗、普雷西亚多与唐凤的三方对谈。Hello everyone, welcome to the exhibition talk of Taiwan's representation at the 58th Venice Biennale. Democracy in Transition, Freedom, Art, and Cooperative Action in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Shu Lea Cheang, Paul B. Preciado, and Audrey Tang in conversation. 我们很荣幸地邀请到代表参展艺术家郑淑丽、策展人暨哲学家保罗·普雷西亚多，以及台湾第一位数位政委唐凤对谈。We're very honored to invite Shu Lea Cheang, selected artist to represent Taiwan at the 58th Venice Biennale, Paul B. Preciado, philosopher and curator of the exhibition, and the first minister with a portfolio on digital affairs in Taiwan, internationally acclaimed social innovator Audrey Tang, to have this special conversation. 那让我们现在以热烈的掌声欢迎3位讲者上台。Now let's give a big round of applause to welcome the speakers to be on stage.
「
Good afternoon, everybody. We are going to conduct this conversation in English, and actually, I'm serving more as a moderator, as an artist and moderator during this conversation. I would introduce the Paul B. Preciado and Audrey Tang in a dialogue. I met Audrey Tang as Audrey Tang in Taipei in 2002 in a Headlock Marathon gathering somewhere downtown. At the time, I was commissioned to co-curate an online exhibition called Kingdom of Piracy for the now defunct Acer Digital Art Center. Audrey, as part of the Alexia initiative, submitted a proposal titled Pirate Port for the KOP show. It's amazing that recently I bring up this proposal again and reread the proposal. I'm just gonna quote from the proposal. The Pirate Port project explores the pirate gene sequencing technology to offer an alternative identity platform for pirates via gene discrimination, pool multiplexing, and cross-site trust chains. The project at the time in 2002 was somehow never realized. Did you read this proposal? Yeah, I did. And how you feel about the proposal now?
Well, I mean, we say blockchain now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, we say blockchain now, but it was like pirate chain back then, but it's the same idea.
Yeah, somehow, so from 2002 to now 2018, I think some of these topics we will be revisiting today for sure. And with Paul, again, I met Paul B. Preciado as Beatrice Preciado in Paris around the same time I met Australia. She walked into my studio with her dog. I think you always carry your dog with you, isn't it? Not carry, you walk your dog. And that was such a moment I always remember in my studio in Paris, in Cité des Arts. I was doing the residency there, and then somehow you feel the sunlight beams in. So since then, I have been collaborating with Preciado in different occasions. In 2008, Preciado brought me to Atelecu in Spain to stage, at the time was a performance piece and workshop called Fluid. It was an exhibition called Feminismo Porno Punk. Yeah, so I think somehow these three words always stay with me. I think a lot of my work is kind of carry the punk, the porn, and the feminismo, yes. This was really the first time when Paul brought me to Atelecu. It was like the first time I was able to realize this particular performance and workshop. It actually did happen because before that, I was censored and shut down 3 times in Norway, in Montreal, and in Berlin. So by 2008, I was able to stage this performance. And then from then on, I really had the desire. It was a concept, Fluid was a concept that I conceived in 2000. So from then on, for the feature film, so from then on, I really decided that I should really realize this film. And it took me, so I conceived the project in 2000. It took me until 2017 to realize the project, and was premiere at the Biennale as the film title is Fluid Zero. And again, Preciado brought me to the Castle in Documentas public program to screen the film the same year, last year, when after the film was released in Berlinale. So both of them have really quite an interesting history and different time, different kind of transition that we will be getting into. And I was really happy to have this opportunity to bring the two together and have a talk together. I was gonna read the bio, but I guess it's on all the event page, so I will skip that then. Yeah. So that's it's gonna be, I promise, will be very exciting. Okay. So as we say, we will have the Slido open, slido.com, to sign in 3 times 3 times 6. We welcome all you to pose questions, and we will kind of come to it or do some intervention with the question. If you pose it, you can pose it in Chinese or in English, is no problem. And I want to bring up just the first question to get us started, not so much that we would answer it. So the first question from Les Cyborg have been avoided. Who can guarantee that this art itself can be more democratic? First, in the art museum, the so-called people have long been disempowered. Shall we start?
Hello, we're making the art more democratic by asking you to like each other's questions. So if you see a question that you would also like us to talk about, just press like on your phone and so on. This is because it's going to be 2 hours, actually more than 2 hours of us continuous talking. It will get kind of boring if you don't have something to like on. And so when you like each other's questions, the one with the most number of like actually flow to the top, and therefore Shu Lea sees it first. The chances are better if when Shu Lea sees it first, she will be like a medium on which you channel your energy through her into our discussion. So she will be a representative to represent your ideas. And that's my take on this question. We basically use technology that enables people to still speak while we're speaking, and that's the setting. And over to you, Paul.
Now? Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. It's really an honor to be in conversation with both of you. I'm, of course, like a friend of Shu Lea for a long time, and now have the pleasure of being the curator for the exhibition. But I also like a big fan of your work, so I'm delighted to be here. And let's see if we are able to, kind of work together through the session, and in a sense that you are able to participate and ask questions and be part of the conversation. Well, how can I say? I have to say that Shu Lea told me before not to talk too much about history, but I also told her, like, well, history for me is just science fiction, because we know very little about our own history, right? So, so when we speak about the museum, we tend to think that art and the museum are spaces for freedom. But I think that if we look back into the history of this institution, we realize that museums were first constituted as places where the trophies of military wars, military campaigns were collected. So, in a sense, the history of war and what I call necropolitics, the history of using violence and death as the only way of doing politics, is at the ground, at the bottom of this institution. So then, of course, the museum, through the 18th and 19th century, became one of the disciplinary institutions through which the idea of what is the national body, what is the history of a nation, has to be constructed, right? Through a series of objects and memories that become part of these collections. I guess that what is interesting is not just the museum. So I would say the museum is not by itself a democratic place. On the contrary, the museum is a place that has to be questioned constantly, and where democracy has to be activated. And that's, I guess, what artists are doing, right? Like trying to bring these questions to the museum, decolonizing the museum, depatriarchalizing the museum, meaning like trying to criticize the gender, patriarchal, heterosexual politics that have been constituting the museum, right? So, and these are some of the questions that are now putting the museum in question, and maybe also transforming the museum even more. But this is maybe a question for you, Audrey, because now with the internet and the new technologies, of course, what the museum is might be also a different question, right? The museum might be not exactly these walls that we see here, but something else, right?
All right, yes. Technologies works in a interesting way. When we turn my scribbles of Paul's statements to a projector here that allows people to comment on it using Slido there, it makes them what we call social objects, right? So these are no longer objects like trophies are on display, but actually become things that people can take a photo on and share on social media or on any other places, and basically gets uploaded to the public internet as part of the commons. And I think that is a kind of overlay layer on top of any what we call spaces. So when we think about spaces, traditionally, we think about it as one space, like one room that we are in, which is part of a larger place, like the museum that we are in, which is part of a city, perhaps, which is part of whatever, right? So it's a very topological view of basically the relationship is always containing one another. But the internet, the part that is inter, is its core. It means that you can take any two places that are otherwise not containing each other, but make links between them so that you can link through your phone from this place, but if you're watching the live stream from another place, you can also receive the signal that we are having here through live streaming and through echo, apparently, and then goes to this kind of third place, which is Slido now, but I mean, there could be any other gathering place online, which is then projected back to this space. So this creates another relationship, what we call a link-based relationship, and a link graph, the lines of links, and the place graph, the line of the containing of spaces. Those two together form what we call bigraph, which is at the same time a graph of spaces, but also a space of links. And these two together, I think, extends both the potentials of the initially limiting physical space, but it also redefines how those spaces interact with each other. Because previously, we only have the laws of physics to work with. We have the sound, the ambient soundscape. We have the optics. We have the physical laws of people feeling their bodies sitting next to each other and so on. But now overlaid with a link graph, we can put on, say, a VR glass and see all the empty chairs. Suddenly people appear in them. We can overlay two spaces together, and we can free up the spaces by introducing a new set of law, what we call code, basically, that defines, just like physical law, what is possible, what is not, what is transparent, what is opaque, and so on, but essentially bring a second layer of physics on top of the place-based physics.
The title, what we set up to do today, democracy in transition. It is a big topic. Who want to scratch it?
Yeah. Maybe just, well, I guess that it partly has to do with, I guess, our own political biography, in a sense, but also extends to thinking about the contemporary condition. So I realized myself when I was transitioning, I started transitioning from, let's say, if you believe in gender binaries, which this is a bigger discussion that we can have, I do not believe in gender binaries, but we live within a gender binary epistemology regime, right? This is the situation. But some of us, we're trying to hack this regime or trying to hack this epistemology. But I started to transition myself like from 2004, using different technologies, using hormones, using other medical technologies, but also technologies of inscription, like for instance, changing the name, changing according to the law, and also writing, because I consider writing, and then we can speak with Audrey as well. What does it mean to write today within the code? But writing is one of the technologies of subject construction, of gender construction, right? So I started doing that in the early 2000s, and then through a slow transition, I got to the point that I'm now. Let's say this is continuing, but then I realized that it was not really myself that I was transitioning. Not just even many of my friends and the people that I work with that were also transitioning, but that we were in a moment of planetary transition, right? That basically we are changing the paradigm and the regime in which we live in a kind of similar way to the very radical and intense changes that were happening through the 15th century when the printing press was invented, with the advent of the first industrial revolution and colonialism and globalization. So now I had the feeling and the impression that because of the transformation and the use of some of the technologies that had been developed during the Second World War, so those technologies that I told you before, that were like necropolitical technologies of death, and if you think about, like, you know, from the nuclear bomb to all the other war technologies, this was like the big festival of the Second World War. So what happened after the Second World War is that these technologies of death transform into technologies of communication, technologies of transformation and production of the body, and radically will change what we understand today, not just as for space. I mean, Audrey was speaking about that a minute ago, like what the notion of a space today is not exactly the same that the one we had in the 15th century. So something similar is happening with the body within the contemporary condition, right? And so still the notion that we have of democracy is very much an analog notion, a very kind of, in a sense, almost archaeological notion of democracy. So what I started to think about, and I wanted to speak with Audrey and Shu Lea about, is precisely what does it mean to act within this condition of, on one side, like a change of paradigm, and what is this change of paradigm that we're getting into with the advent of the new technologies and internet, but also, of course, like the expansion of military and surveillance technologies, because the internet is also one of the military technologies, right? So it's not so clear if we are getting into a domain of control, or if there is a possibility for action and agency, and therefore what might be the role of the artist in all that.
Right. So when Paul said that internet was a technology of the war, that is actually literal. It's not a metaphor. The internet started as a research project from DARPA, which is the defense arm of the US government. And the design of internet is explicitly designed to maintain the communication after a nuclear war. That's its design specification. We know a lot of ways to connect people together, but until the research team did the internet protocol, the IP protocol, nobody really knows how to survive a communication network after the war, the nuclear war. And so they figure out this simple idea that they call end-to-end principle. It means that only the person initiating the conversation, the communication, and the people receiving the communication should determine the content. And everything in between can be changed. It can be through optic lines. It could be through carrier pigeons. It could be through, no, there really is a document that describes how to use carrier pigeons to transmit internet packets. It could be through trucks, actually. There's one about trucks with hard disk on the trucks, and so on, or interplanetary rockets or whatever. It doesn't care about the technologies that's used in the middle, but it cares a lot about how to get reliably a signal from one person to another person. That's called the end-to-end principle, and that defines the internet, because nobody knows what will still work after a nuclear war. And that was the defining characteristic of the internet. Of course, today, internet is separate from the US itself, right? It declared kind of sovereignty. It no longer respond to any of the US agencies anymore. The United Nations ITU wants to get Internet Society under its control, but the Internet Society never agreed. We only agreed to hold one yearly conference together called the Internet Governance Forum, which I appeared as a robot last year. But the idea very simply is that the Internet itself, through radical transparency and through voluntary association, the two simple idea that any decision made about the Internet must be participatory by anyone on the Internet. This is a very simple idea. And the participation itself must also be public on the Internet through live streaming and other technologies. It kind of constantly reflects on itself. And I think it is also a very artist thing to do, because Internet at the end is about a lot of code that powers machines. And if you're seeing the code as a regulator or as a lawyer or as any top-down institutionalist, you will see it as something that's written, like, I don't know, the code of Hammurabi, the code of Napoleon, the code of whatever. It will be something that is like written on a tablet, maybe not iPad, stone tablet, and you cannot really change it freely. But through this radical participation, the hackers of the internet basically are invited to test the limit of internet, to invent new uses like blockchain on the internet, and without asking for anyone's permission. And this, what we call permissionless invention, meaning if you want to extend the internet, only you and the person who are going to communicate with you need to agree on this new way of communication. Nobody in between, including the earlier inventors of the internet, they cannot say anything about it. So this permissionless invention, or the idea of hacking on the internet itself, is what enabled internet to still grow after all these decades. And I think it is a very artist's take on code, because if you're an institutionalist, you will just keep the code running. You will not hack the code, and you will not do permissionless invention. You will always ask for permission before inventing. But the internet still today is very artsy in the sense that it is permissionless invention.
But it's true that whenever I listen to you speaking, I have the impression that you're like, extremely utopian. That your view of the internet is really that we have like a full agency, that this is a space of maximum freedom, right? Nevertheless, I tend to have the impression that it's also a space of enormous control, right? So. How do you see that dialectic? I mean, or if you, I know that the kind of activist work that you've been doing, hack activism, but for everyone else, that is, it might not be at the same level of expertise in terms of coding or writing the code, or having access to the code.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, even though theoretically anyone can take any legal interpretation or legal regulation and change it, right? Because they are not under copyright. Any work by your lawyer and so on, by regulators, they are not copyrighted. So theoretically, there is nothing preventing you from doing a legal change analysis or whatever, and maybe through one of our sandbox mechanisms here in Taiwan, you can say, okay, I want to try this alternate version of regulation on my municipality for a year for everybody to see that it's a good idea before the municipality adopts it as the new regulation. I mean, we have the system here. But just having the sandbox system doesn't automatically mean everybody become a lawmaker. It doesn't automatically mean that people know where exactly in the regulation is the one that affects people's lives. In fact, that is what the legal civics basic education is all about. Because we can consider if it's only a few people knowing how to use any technology. I will use fire as an example because it's easiest to conceptualize. If you only allow a few priests or whatever to control the use of fire, And most of the people are kind of illiterate about the use of the technology. We've seen those societies before, and we see fire burn through the entire cities because of the limited control of a technology, and people generally don't know how to manage that technology by themselves. But what we say about democratic, both in the terms of learning to cook very early on, and also learning civics very early on, and also learning code very early on, is just to build a different shape of expertise, where people at any time, if they feel comfortable, they can always ask somebody higher on the expertise chain for more input, and there will be always a fluid conversation between people who know about the legal issues a little bit more, like the paralegal people, but not yet lawmakers or constitutional court judges. So when the constitutional court, for example, makes an interpretation, you see a flow on the internet where it gets translated into something that the practicing lawyers will understand, that the people with some paralegal training will understand, and then into what just people with basic liberal arts education will understand, and so on. And so if anyone at any point have some ideas of how to contribute to it, of course we see a lot of these materials also getting translated back. And I think these kind of feedback and feed forward, the two-way translation among expertise is really what keeps any technology, including fire and legal code and also computer code, from being completely dominating. Without this dynamic two-way translation, it's almost guaranteed to be a surveillance and or control technology. So I do agree with your premise, but this is what everybody can just identify your kind of position on any expertise and just form communities that basically build a ladder of expertise together.
I guess that one of the issues is to be able to recognize a technology as a technology. Because I guess that sometimes we are not able to act politically or to have any kind of agency just because we naturalize a technology. So we don't see it as something that, as a code, as a language, as something that can be intervened into, you know. This is what happens mostly, for instance, with gender, sex, and sexuality, that people have this naturalized relation to it, and they think that, you know, that in relation to gender, they're just like two genders or two sexes, and that this cannot be changed. But what some of us are doing, in very much as hackers are doing on the level of writing the code, is understanding gender and sexuality and sex as political technologies, and therefore like trying to intervene within those technologies. So have agency on the technologies that are producing your subjectivity. And this is something that I've been calling opening up the pill, which I think is quite close to some of the things that you're doing, but in my case, my work is more related to biotechnologies, chemical technologies, and so on. So technologies of production of the body. And this expression of opening up the pill comes from the 90s, when HIV patients were not given the choice of being or not the object of medical trials. So they didn't have the choice of knowing what pill they were taking, right? So basically what would happen is that depending on which pill you would be taking, if you are like an HIV positive person, some of them would be dying, some of them will not die, right? So what happened is that among themselves, and this is very close to this kind of cooperation that you are promoting, among themselves, they came together and they said, like, we need to open up the pill. We need to break up the pill and get to understand the technologies that we are eating, that we're like, you know, digesting, in order to be able to know if we will die or we will live, right? So, and they started talking about opening up the pill. And for me, this is very close to the idea of hacking the biocode, not just the code in terms of the internet, but of course I guess that part of the work that I'm doing, and it's also very much related to your work, is trying to resituate the body within this transformation of, let's say, media technologies, visual technologies, internet technologies, right? So, so yeah, like opening up the pill meaning that each of us would have to, at a certain point, ask the question, what are the technologies that I am using and that are constituting me as a subject, whatever they are, right? Like that allow me to be like female or male or heterosexual or not. So for instance, maybe at some point we can show one of the images that I brought for you so you understand. Yes, there are. Yes, okay. Yeah, if they are here, we can show, yeah, maybe just like to show this image that has a lot to do with the work that Shu Lea is doing for the pavilion. This is one image of the Panopticon, which is an architecture from the early 18th century that was thought to maximize at the beginning, before being used for prisons, it was thought to maximize the production of workers in a factory, basically, with the idea that having a central tower from which someone was supposed to be watching everyone working. So basically, all the workers would feel like the pressure of being watched, and suddenly would start like working much more and much better, right? This idea was then used by Jeremy Bentham to basically to promote the construction within European governments, but not only European. Recently, we've been visiting a prison like that in the mid-south of Taiwan that was constructed during the Japanese occupation. So this became like a model of control and maximizing of the production within not just European, but also like globally disciplinary institutions. What is interesting, if oh, that's nice. That's nice too. I never seen like this image with your writing before. This is already like quite a hacking. So if you, yeah, then you see the central structure. But what, yes, and this is the prison of Chaya, maybe that is here in Taiwan, and that now is a museum, but that was constructed during the time of the Japanese occupation. Right, so you can see, I mean, it's not exactly a full panopticon, but the model is quite close to a panopticon. Yes, exactly. Well, but yeah, you see the structure. But what is interesting is that in an architecture like this, your subject position, your possibilities of action are defined by the location that you have within this architecture, right? And yes, and then, okay, so in a sense, those architectures of power, they work as exoskeletons, right? Like a structure is really like a frame that constrains the body physically. So depending on your position, you have a different agency. It's very clear now, for instance, you are there, we're here, someone is holding the iPad, I have the mic. So, for instance, something that is happening today when we're saying like, okay, you can send messages to the Slido, is that in a sense we're distributing agency by expanding the technologies. So for you to actually modify the relationship that you have to us, right? But within the disciplinary society, within the 19th and early 20th century, basically the position that you have as subject was defined by your exact location within a physical architecture. Meaning if you're a student, you're sitting down on one of these chairs. If you're the professor, you're here, right? And this defines not just a relation of knowledge, that I can give you knowledge and you can give me nothing, but also defines a relation of power, right? So the thing is that something is changing when suddenly we go from already the abstract I of the panopticon. Well, this is an abstraction in the sense that the people that are in the cells or working in the factory, they don't really know if there is anyone watching them. They think there might be someone. So already the I that is looking is an abstraction, right? But something, a step farther will happen when suddenly the I is not human, that the I is an electronic I, right? Something, and therefore this I can be fully disseminated within a space. And even like the I can be in your pocket, right? Suddenly you don't have only two eyes, you have many more, and some of them are looking at you, and some of them are your own electronic eyes looking at others, right? So there is a multiplication of the I, a machine making, a becoming machine of the I, which complicates this relationship of power. Well, this, I can tell you more about that, but what is interesting for me is that something very similar was happening within the domain of gender, of the production of gender and sexuality after the Second World War. Because what is going to happen is that precisely because of the development of a lot of new technologies during the war, some of these technologies will be used for the control of techniques of reproduction. And this is exactly what will happen with Pincus and Rock, which are like two doctors that in the late 40s actually invented the contraception pill. And so the contraception pill was at the beginning, there were just pills that came into a bottle, right? But no one really knew how to use them. So they had to invent the dispenser. And the dispenser had this shape. You can also have this one that is more common now, but it is still. And then just for you to start thinking differently and to look at the technologies that you use differently. So I like to point to this analogy between the panopticon and the pill dispenser, because there you see the translation from an architecture of power that is external to the body to a new miniaturized chemical technology that now enters within your body and transforms your possibility of action. Meaning, for instance, your possibility of being pregnant or not, having or not having, or becoming like reproductive or not after a sexual practice, which fully changes the notion, the traditional notion of heterosexuality. So, for instance, I don't know if you consider yourself heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, polysexual, multisexual, pansexual, asexual. But just think that many of those notions are historical, were invented by medical discourses, and are mediated by technologies as much as language is coded by technology and as the internet is a technology. So one of the things that I wanted to point to today, and that I thought it was interesting about this conversation between us, is that you see the relationship between the advent of the internet at a certain point and the transformation of medical and biotechnologies in the production of subjectivity, because we always think, okay, this is technological, but the body is not, right? So yes, the body that we have now, the notion of the contemporary body has to change, cannot be anymore this anatomic fiction from the 15th century that we keep using. Yes, but I don't know if how do you like to interact with that, because
well,
or maybe you want to go to
yeah, maybe Shu Lea would like to intervene.
Actually, not so much. I wouldn't. I just want to actually pause for a moment because, yeah, sorry. Somehow, actually, in refer to this question, what will be your idea for the exhibition next year? How will you do it? Actually, we are exactly talking about how we're going to do it next year. Through our conversation, which is actually going places quite a lot. So I actually just want to do a bit of summing up a bit from where we are at. The question about technology, I think in a more common sense, we seem to always refer technology as more of technical technology, electronic, mechanical, it seems, you know. So at the moment, I think the way we are talking about technology is actually pretty much refer to any kind of almost intervention technology. So in terms of gender intervention, medical intervention, body intervention. And this is quite an interesting area, actually will be part, kind of the main thread for the Venice Biennale exhibition we are working on. The other question is the question of the binary. I think the word binary, non-binary will keep coming up. Then again, we would refer to what is the binary technology. You know, as soon as we're speaking about technology, just by the way how mechanical electronic equipment is designed, so you have the male and female in terms of the, I always, this is the part that drives me crazy. All the time working with technology, it seems I'm working always with the male and female. The female needs to find the male to plug in, the male-female plug-in thing, and then finally you have to find an adapter, right? So this is like, it seems to be the journey of my technical technical journey. So actually, if we start talking about the technology in the sense of the binary male and female, then we should, again, redefine what would be the kind of able to break down the body binary of male and female. This is another topic that we would be dealing with in a certain way in the exhibition. Consider this, and I think somehow we will get into this, yeah, binary, non-binary, and how we would redefine ourselves. Actually, earlier on, there's also a question about how do we queer the museum. What would the structure of the museum if here we are in a grand museum, and what would the artists do within this system? What would be the intervention in the museum system, including how do we queer the museum in that sense? Second topic I feel like you both touch on is actually about the architecture, which referred to, I think, Paul, your question with architecture is always really more referred to the power of the space, isn't it? So all the time, you refer back to how do we switch or shifting this power relationship in certain way, how we position ourselves, not only the space, the seating, the left to right, or the right to left, the top and up. Well, in this case, we can easily get into sexual positioning, I guess, which would be quite exciting in the Tuesday afternoon before 6 o'clock. Anyway, okay, so of course, I think the confined architecture space, and in this way, I would like to refer to the question earlier on, a question about the title 3x3x6. Actually, the title 3x3x6 refer to a prison cell that is 9 square meter and 6 surveillance camera. And it's actually quite a certain kind of prison cell in Europe. Actually in Chaya prison, we see even smaller cells. But these kind of 9 square meter, 6 cameras, surveillance camera cell is actually designed to break down any prisoner's spirit. So it's meant to break you kind of, you just lose it, you'll lose it. You definitely lose it within this kind of confined space. In a lot of, I think we talk about in France, you know, for example, a lot of terrorists or suspects of terrorists will be incarcerated in this kind of cell. However, the title 3 times 3 times 6 actually taking these prison cell as a more of a symbolic space, and to expand it into the current surveillance system that we live in, consider China's 20 million facial recognition surveillance camera in every street corner for its land. So also when Paul started talking about Panopticon of the 17th century of Bentham, actually today I would refer to the Panopticon as a data Panopticon, because the whole surveillance system with the camera capturing us, our data being captured and into big data, I think we are all part of bigger Panopticon that is it's really hard to escape, or hard to seek another space, yeah? In this sense, yeah, I really want to maybe kind of stop here and let you continue then.
Okay.
I didn't finish any sentence, did I?
Well, you asked many questions, but yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Many different questions. I don't know, maybe you want to say something about the code, because this is it's quite fascinating to think about the possibility of going beyond a binary code. And I mean, I can talk about the binary regime in gender and sexuality, but I want you to talk about the...
Yeah, I'll just make one intervention, which is Shu Lea talked about always having to find adapters, and that is really true. I mean, this old technology called Apple Pencil, it is really symbolic, because the only way to charge it is just to plug it into the iPad, and it looks really, gender symbolic, right? But now with the latest generation of Apple Pencil, it no longer works that way, right? If I may, I can just bring out the Apple Pencil, and it just attaches itself to the side of the iPad, because it's now magnetic and wireless. So what I'm saying is that there are different ways to configure the connections, and the old way of binary pairing basically assumes a one-on-one relationship, and the one-on-one relationship was there because it's easier to reason about, it's easier to program for, it's easier to code for, basically. Whereas if you have a Wi-Fi or a Bluetooth or a 5G connection, there may be any number of devices in the same space, and you have to have a lot of software to make the case of why this is more efficient than the old way. And so I will bring in something very technical. In the old way of internet protocol, which we're using right now, it's called IPv4. And it's version 4 when it's like 4 digits, 101.101.101.101, which is a real internet address, by the way. But people generally find these numbers are limited in numbering, so each number become more and more expensive. And the internet community decide to open up the space of internet devices from V4 to V6. And now you have more spaces than you can have in the number of stars in the universe, perhaps. So now it doesn't cost anything to have an internet access. So Taiwan has been really growing in the adoption of IPv6. But IPv6 bring a very interesting technology called the multicast. So in the old bad way of internet, the only way for like 50 people to connect to one another is to essentially form a hub and spoke structure where like 50 people connect to the same server, and the server redistributes their conversations to one another, and each one has a binary relationship. There is the server, right, and the client, which is also kind of sexual in connotation. But in any case, that was the old way of what we call a single cast. But now with multicast, it can be configured in IPv6 in any which way, like this, right? So this forms what we call a interestingly promiscuous, which is a technical term, I promise you, a promiscuous configuration where people just relate like gossips what they hear from each other, and so it enables a much higher quality conversation by having everybody be at once the receiver and also the distributor. And so this kind of multicast, non-binary relationship is within the internet protocol that we're now transitioning into as we speak. Taiwan actually has the fastest growing adoption of IPv6. So as basic, as essential as the internet protocol itself, there is a reimagination from a more binary and limited and scarce resource thought pattern into a more abundant, everybody can get any number you think of, and they all promiscuously connect together in a multicast way, and that's the only intervention I would like to add.
Congratulations, it's only 1 hour has passed, but we finally bring internet and sex together, okay.
No, just saying that while I was listening to you, I thought, oh, something very similar is happening within the discussion in terms of gender and sexuality. Basically, we could read all the fights that have been happening from, let's say, the late 19th century in terms of feminism, the homosexual movement, then the gay and lesbian and trans movement and the queer movement and so on. We could read all these fights in terms precisely of modifying the epistemology of gender and sexuality. Again, to go back into this way of reading history as science fiction, in the sense, when I say this is because basically my experience when reading history of sexuality is that we know so very little of our own history of sexuality, that when you read something from the 17th century, you might think, okay, well, this is like, it's going to be either the future or it's completely insane, right? So it's quite interesting to kind of almost learn to think about history differently, right? So, and maybe also, once we reappropriate critically this history, this is almost a moment of cognitive emancipation, right? If you suddenly say, wow, things were not the same way, and therefore they can change, they can be transformed, as the code is constantly being transformed and in discussion. So probably, I mean, the gender binary system that we have is quite recent, didn't exist until the 17th century. Before, at least, for instance, I'm speaking now about Europe and the West. What we had was a regime with just one sex, the male sex, and the female sex didn't really exist, other than just like a completely degenerated variation of masculinity, right? So we could see like all the fights within feminism as a way precisely of writing in the code, right? A way of saying like, okay, we need to modify this epistemology to be able to write difference in. What is going to happen is that along the 17th and 18th century, what we will have is precisely the invention of the model, this epistemology, let's say a representation regime, a diagram of knowledge in which things can be represented with two sexes. This is quite recent, but we're still fighting with that. These two sexes meaning that you can only be male or female. But there is a huge epistemological crisis happening in the 40s, exactly at the time that the Second World War is taking place, exactly at the time that many of the anti-colonial movements are started to grow within the world as well. Exactly at that point, the medical sciences, but also many of the movements, they realized that many bodies cannot, of human beings, I say that because not all the bodies are like immediately human, many bodies cannot be assigned either female or male gender when they're being born, right? So therefore, they have to be intervened, they have to be either operated, hormones have to be administered to them, and this is the moment of the invention of the modern notion of gender and the invention of what we call the John Money Protocol, which in a sense is, I would say, more or less I would say, is a software in terms of gender that is amazing that we keep using this software, right? When we should be like rewriting this code constantly, and that's what we're trying to do within the movements. And for instance, I would say that the work that Shu Lea Cheang is doing is in a sense experimenting with the aesthetics of gender and sexuality, producing an enormous amount of new grammars, of new codings, some of which will not be fully inscribed within reality. Some of them remain within fiction. But it's important to have those fictions to be able to imagine political change, right? Because the first and most difficult thing to do is to change the way you're thinking. This is the most difficult thing to do, and this is what artists will be helping us doing, right? So what we see now is a strong fight precisely for opening up the binary code within gender and sexuality, and maybe something like quite similar to what you were saying before, Audrey, in terms of the IPv6. So something like that could look like an N+1 genders. So not just female or male, but any gender. And therefore maybe like avoiding completely to be assigned to female or male gender when you're being born, right? So just like erase fully, completely, and therefore like multiply up to infinity the amount of genders that we could have.
Just come up. Audrey, can you read it and translate it? Oh, did it disappear?
I think
Okay.
Dad's laptop went to sleep.
Okay.
So we'll give it some time while
I'm
switching
not
to
sure.
our backup plan,
Okay.
which is to bring it up here.
Yeah.
Better.
Okay. Yeah. So actually, I think, yeah, in a sense, when I say I know Audrey, when, well, I think you're still a hacktivist, still always a hacktivist. So in the sense of hacktivism or hacker of technology or computer codes or hacker as sex and gender and body. And so when we are talking about hacking, we actually not limited to computer codes anymore. So refer to this particular question about, would you like to pick up from?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So the question reads, about gender hacking. This discussion falls into the category of post-human or post-humanity. And the questioner, which is anonymous, says that it seems to connotate the notion of seeing the subjectivity model as an information model instead of a material model. And so it coincides with the idea that consciousness itself is a epiphenomena. It's not just phenomena, it's epiphenomena. It's something out of the phenomenal world, or whether it is a new noble in evolution. So they would like to ask about the relationship between information and body, because does it actually mean that subjectivity is purely information, or is it also somewhat body, or body is also purely information? What does that even mean? So would Paul like to take on this?
Well, I guess that what is changing is what we understand by body, by what a body is. I'm shifting the notion of the body and trying to move to displace this notion and use the notion of somatic, which, as we speak about, it's mostly in French when we speak about a bibliothèque, to say a library, for instance. So basically like a huge collection, and a living, for me a body is a living archive, right? But within this living archive, there are like carbon components, and they are silicon components, right? So we do not have just like, the body is not just organic. The body is made out of many different technological and organic components. Some of them are information-based. Some of them, for instance, what is a body without language? Well, maybe a body that has no language at all. I do not refer to speaking, but to oral speaking, right? But to language, might not be able to be considered part of the human species, not be able to be welcome within a society, right? So what is human is constantly being discussed. What is human is not just defined by nature, because even this difference between humanity and animality, between what is alive and what is not alive, is also an object of constant political debate. So this is constantly being discussed, right? And just to mention that you can go and see the post-nature exhibition downstairs or upstairs, right? Upstairs, that precisely is dealing with this issue and this topic. What I don't like so much when we immediately go into the post-human debate is that it seems that we're just within a kingdom of just machines, right? And there is no agency. And unfortunately, I would say that machines are our sons, our offsprings, right? We are like, this is one of the things that we're living with, and we're now in a kingdom where there are already also machines with us. But this is not just only machines, right? So therefore, even machines will have agency and political agency as well, right? So as you know, for instance, now, I don't know how it's here, but the European community has been recently discussing if robots can be considered legal people, right? Legal persons, right? I don't know if this debate is taking place here, but I'm sure even more than in Europe, right? With the paradoxical side that at the same time that the European community is discussing this, the same European community is refusing the entrance within the European community of hundreds of thousands of refugees, therefore human, organic, and so on, that are trying to cross the Mediterranean because of the war, among other things, on Syria, but also because of economic and war conditions in Africa, right? So what we could say is that what are the conditions for a certain body, being a body, organic or non-organic, to be recognized as human, and therefore to belong to a human social community? This is a huge political debate, and has to be, for me, I mean, one of the things that I see your work, for instance, is really like activating this debate and being able to bring more people within that debate, including machines, including the Internet of Things, right? So, what I kind of would be cautious about is precisely going into this very dystopic way of just like thinking, oh, we are in the post-human, and therefore, like, okay, we've done away with any kind of political agency, and we just have to, you know, I don't know exactly what, but maybe wait for what is happening today as well, that we just arrived in Mars, and that's it, right? Like recolonizing the world with the post-human being.
Yeah, there's something new that Shu Lea has highlighted. It's from AM0336, which is a very interesting name to have that has more cybernetic nature, I would say. It says, quote, "Art must constantly intervene in politics until politics stops interfering with art," unquote. What's my view on this statement? Well, as a poetician, my main work in politics is just to write poems, and so for me, the intervention of art in politics, I think, must not stop even when politics stops interfering with art, because art need to become politics. And when Paul talked about Internet of Things, I was reminded of a poem that I wrote when I was appointed digital minister 2 years ago. And it begins with the idea of Internet of Things because it was very popular back then. And I think it contributes to a discussion that is not healthy because when we talk about Internet of Things, we're kind of implicitly saying there's things and there's humans, right? And humans use the internet now, but things will use the internet in the future. And it's a very kind of post-human kind of discourse and also very binary. Right, so I wrote a poem to kind of dissolve that binary, and it's my job description actually as the Taiwan's digital minister. And it goes like this: when we see Internet of Things, let's make it an Internet of Beings. When we see virtual reality, let's make it a shared reality. When we see machine learning, let's make it collaborative learning. When we see user experience, let's make it about human experience. And whenever we hear that a singularity is near, let us always remember that a plurality is here. So this is a poetic take on politics, and especially the politics of the Internet of Things, as Paul just described. So that's my answer to this question. I don't know whether Paul has something to contribute.
Well, I don't know. For me, this question maybe brings us back to the question of how to queer the museum that you mentioned before, Shu Lea, in the sense of, for me, like asking the question of art and politics in such a abstract way, that for me doesn't make any sense. And this, for me, it's just like what art, what politics, right? Like in which context are we? Of which context are we speaking about? Art and politics are never separated. Basically, art is always political, right? It can be normative, conservative, or it can be very critical. But there is always, or it can, in a sense, it can repeat the normative aesthetics, or it can be suddenly like troubling that aesthetics, or complicating it, or just like, you know, introducing some variation within the code. But there is always, it's not possible that any kind of art will be like completely outside of politics, even if it's just like a beautiful, it could be beautiful painting, but beautiful painting is painting according to the canon, and therefore like reproducing a certain code, right? So anyway, but that's why I instead of posing the question at such an abstract level, it's easier for us to maybe think, if we want to think about like, okay, can we make the museum more queer, or can we, you know, queer the museum, or can we de-patriarchalize the museum, right, or decolonize the museum? And I think that there are several strategies that have been tried out in different places. One of the strategies that for me becomes problematic at a certain point is the strategy of identity politics and representation, which is basically saying like, okay, for a museum to be more feminist, let's have more women being exhibited, right? For a museum to be more queer, or let's have more homosexual artists being exhibited. And for a museum to be more decolonial, or let's have more indigenous artists to be exhibited, right? But I think that this strategy, for me, is still problematic in the sense that it contributes to naturalize what we understand for men and women, indigenous and non-indigenous, heterosexual and homosexual. And I think that the challenge that we're facing today as curators or working within the institution is precisely to change the epistemology of the museum. So can we open the code of the museum? Can we radically say, instead of just like, oh, let's make a feminist exhibition and let's invite suddenly like 20 women, it's like, hello, but do you think that with 20 women, the horrifying patriarchal idea of art that we already have will change? No. So maybe it's not just about inviting men or women or homosexuals or heterosexuals. This is ridiculous. This is just like buying into the identity politics. what would be challenging is like trying to think collectively and therefore like giving more access to the technologies of knowledge production and the technologies of art making to all of us to question what we understand for, let's say, male, female, heterosexual, homosexual, and therefore go beyond those dichotomies, right? So, and this is what I think that the museum can become a radical democratic place, because it might be one of the few spaces today in which all of us, like for instance, if you go to the university or to the school, you're supposed to be there to get a credit at the end, right? So you go and you say, okay, I want to be, I want to do industrial design, right? So you better learn how to do it. And if you don't do it well, then you don't get your credit, right? But when you come to the museum, you don't really know what you're coming for. And I think this is the good thing about it, right? That we don't come for anything, but just we come to ask questions, to criticize, to change the way we see the world, right? And to do it with fiction and with poetry. And therefore, like, really to breaking up the code and maybe collectively inventing other codes, right? That go beyond this binary. So I think that this is for me, you know, a different way of looking at the museum, that just like being more inclusive and bringing the minorities is a completely different way of saying, like, let's radically transform the epistemology of the museum.
This is probably a very good point for me to break into this question. I think if we, again, going back to the space and shifting the space, and so the question would be, in this case, how do we queer a country?
Right. So just for context for Paul, we just had a national referenda, 5 of which about gender and sexuality and marriage equality and everything. And the outcome of the referendum is that people generally, and when I say people, I mean people who went to vote, people who went to vote generally, I mean over majority, wanted a legal protection of the right of so-called same-sex union, but don't call it marriage in the civil code, call it something else, like gay marriage or whatever, in some other part of the law system outside of the civil code. It will, of course, provide the same level of protection except for the name. And that was the outcome of the referenda. Now, the question asks, in this moment of backlash, should we perhaps re-understand the idea of a post-house, post-family, post-marriage ideas? These ideas were kind of discarded during the referenda movement, which focus on full marriage equality, and we should think more about companionship, thinking about a family consists of multiple partners, and the other ideas, and maybe in this referenda outcome, which is binding, that we will have a separate legal code for so-called same-sex marriage, maybe we can bring up those new ideas of pluralistic unions. What do you think about it?
Okay, big question. Well, I think that this is an excellent idea, but I don't think it should be like a plan B. You know, because it seems like a kind of consolation prize, like, oh, we didn't win the election, so, well, let's go for plurality. Yeah, it's like, well, it's a little bit, like, I would say it's a little bit the same discussion that we had with or that I was trying to evoke when speaking about the museum. Like, there are 2 different strategies, right? One, that I would call liberal democracy, like to come back to a more, let's say, common way of speaking about politics, right? Like liberal democracy, in which you assume that everyone is equal in front of the law, and from that point on you say, okay, men, women, heterosexuals, homosexuals, transsexuals is always a problem, but anyway, like, well, transsexuals, you as well, you're just 3, so, you know, so well, just like stay there, don't say much, but, so you have like all these people that are asking to be included and recognized by the law. And they're asking the same, having access to the same institutions and the same legal norms than the other ones, right? But the problem is that first, and this is going to sound too harsh, but first, we're asking for recognition to a state that normally is an agent of violence, right? So it's very difficult to ask for recognition. I don't think we should be asking for recognition. I think we should be very critical, or even it's like, why are we asking for permission to get married, even if marriage is a patriarchal institution that has to do precisely with the restriction of freedom of women historically, right? So why do we have to ask for this right? So I guess that instead of getting entangled within the whole debate of asking the state for permission to get married or to get like a civil union, we should start thinking about how becoming a citizen of the world is changing today. In which conditions? Who is allowed to be a citizen of this world, in which some of us are allowed to travel with a passport and have certain conditions and privileges, and the rest of the world, which is the majority of the world, have right to nothing mostly, right? So I think it's a question of radical justice that has to be asked here, not so much asking for permission to the state, right? And therefore maybe, at least from the point of view of gender and sexuality, I guess that, and from the experience we have in Europe or in the US, in the places where, some of the places where they have acquired the right to, let's say, homosexual marriage, for instance, or civil unions, what we realize is that one of the reasons that this particular law is being used is to have access to live in a particular country, to become citizen of a country, right? I think that this is the major question, and it's like having access. The issue of migration today is much more important than the issue of marriage, right? And this should be at the core of any political discussion rather than marriage. This is one thing. Second thing, as I said before, the debate today within radical gender and queer movements is to get rid of gender assignation at birth. And therefore, if you think it well, if you do not have a paper that says that you're like a man or a woman, then no one has to give you permission to marry someone else, because there will be no heterosexual and no homosexual marriage. And it's important for us to think that those notions, heterosexuality and homosexuality, that we keep using as they are like rocks, they are like, okay, they seem to be that they were like in history forever, they're medical categories that were invented within the 19th century. I mean, let alone that have nothing to do with the Chinese tradition. This is a whole different discussion, but we could also get into that discussion. So it's like, why are we discussing with these notions that, in a sense, were colonial, so it had nothing to do with the way of understanding sexuality within, let's say, Oriental culture at the beginning, right? So I think that what is interesting for me is sometimes to change the terms of the debate, because otherwise it seems that within the movements, we keep saying like, oh, we have to get the equality right to, you know, like equal right for marriage. It is like, and this is like, this will structure all fights within the movement, and then we lose so much time when the actual questions today are like much more about accessing technologies. And of course, marriage is an institution and therefore it's a technology, but is it the technology that we really want to construct ourselves today? Maybe not, right? It's like, how useful is this technology compared, let's say, for instance, to coding or programming? Well,
I'll say something about citizenry access. In Taiwan, many of us, I think most of us here, have something what we call the national ID, and everyone has a national ID that maybe look like, you know, I don't know, 2, 2, 3, 5, something, 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 right? And then, but people of a foreign passport, even if they have permanent resident certificates, maybe they have been like spending all their life in Taiwan, they have a something like AC 2, 3, something, something. They have a different class of identification number, and so they're prevented actually access that's shouldn't be excluded, but are excluded because of code. If people go to order a movie ticket, or if they ordered some meals online, or maybe they buy a train ticket from the train station and use the Chinese, not the English interface of the website, they will be asked to fill in a national ID, and when they put in AC223 something, it will be rejected, saying it is not a valid national ID because the second digit is not a digit, it is an alphabet. And because of that, they are denied access that by law and by regulation actually should be provided to permanent residents, but it's rejected simply because the letter don't look like a digit, which is very much in tune of the citizenry access. Of course, starting next year, we're going to change that. The number here is going to be changed. The AC something something, it will be replaced by A9 something something, right? And so basically the numbers 7, 8, and 9 will be used in place of the letters C and so on, A and C and so on. And so that is a change in the design of the code, not the legal code, just computer code, just the numbering system to provide more inclusive access of visitors, permanent residents, and everybody in between who don't hold a local passport to still have access to local services. Now that brings an interesting thing because there's many countries with passport of a non-binary gender now. And we traditionally use the second digit to distinguish between the genders, right? So what do we do of foreign nationals when they become getting these new numbers that are non-binary, or do we force them to choose 8 or 9, or do we roll a dice or something? So the result is that we make the number 7 the non-binary digit. So if you are a non-binary, or you choose to be a non-binary in your home country, if your passport says you're non-binary, then here you are also non-binary. So our entire computer code system has to be rewritten to recognize the potentiality of a non-binary gender. And I'm saying this purely on a code level. This is not a law level thing.
But I think this is super interesting because this shows that instead of fighting for gay marriage, for instance, we could be fighting to change administration codes, right? And just like basically deleting certain codes or modifying them or being able to rewrite other codes. This is a completely different discussion than just like fighting for marriage, right?
Quite aware of the frustration after the election, particularly with the vote in the referendum, with a totally public participation to voted no to the same-sex marriage. However, as Paul mentioned, I think we really do have to question all these systems that what are we fighting for? You know, what are we fighting against? Yeah. In the same time, it seems like we are so much driven by certain cooperative actions that we want to get into the discussion about what is the cooperating action. Mm-hmm. In that sense, how do we what would this solidarity alliance be? You know, rather than fighting for the name of marriage or the couple or that, you know, what would be a bigger or a different and alternative agenda that we can get into without kind of confine ourselves into finding our space in society or the norm?
Well, I guess that has to do with leaving behind or going beyond identity politics, right? Which is, if you organize your fights according to identity politics, then women are supposed to be fighting for feminism. Gay people, whatever they are, they're supposed to be fighting for gay rights, trans and so on and so forth. And then if you can do the same within kind of nationalist language, you can also be fighting for this or that nation, for that or this or that identity, right? But if you go beyond that identity framework, then you have to start constructing what I call synthetic alliances. Alliances that are not based on natural identity. Just because we are questioning, we're precisely questioning natural identity. That identity is natural. Identity is always culturally and politically constructed. So those alliances cannot be based on identity, because women being what is a woman is still a full discussion. What is a man is still a full discussion, let alone what is to be Taiwanese or Chinese. I mean, I'm not going to get into that, but you know. So those are like big questions that cannot be answered immediately and through a natural, just like a set of empirical elements, but has to be, all of them have to be the object of a critical debate, have to be open for fictional and political imagination.
So unavoidable, the question of the technological utopianism was mentioned here in the question. I guess this is another good topic to get into, isn't it? The utopia. Actually, in myself, in my work, I think I swim between being called, my work is utopian or dystopian. Yeah, so in a certain way, I think we all kind of swim in between these two states of mind, or states. Audrey?
Sure. So yeah, I have been called a Imagineer. I think yeah, Imagineering is a real word. When I worked on a new computer language, and the computer language tried to bring together different paradigms of programmers thinking about the world, of the functional paradigm, of thinking the world as mathematics, of the object-oriented paradigm, where people think of the world as objects interacting with each other, of the imperative, where people think of machines as subjects to obey command, and logical, and so on. There's many different worldviews. And back when we were doing the Pro 6 language, which now has a name called Raku, or in Japanese, I think it's just happiness, right? So the Raku language is now done in the sense that it's a stable language that's running in computers, and it enables people who view the world through a particular lens to nevertheless compose something that can be understood and interacted with by people who view the world with a different lens. And that was considered impossible, or at least extremely difficult 10 years ago, but we did that anyway. And so when we did that, it's called Imagineering. So to that question, I would simply want to show this 17 colors that I'm wearing on my shirt all the time. And these are what the United Nations call the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. And to many people, indeed, I would also make the case that even the SDGs itself that we need by year 2030 get to the point of there's no poverty, where there's education for everyone, where there's access to justice and things like that, and climate change, and affordable energy, and so on, is utopian. I will not deny that, because what they did, the UNDP did, is that around 2012 or so, they start planning a questionnaire to ask more than 1 million people in the world, what is the future you want to see in the year 2030? And so there's like 1 million voices. Their compendium is literally called 1 million voices. They collected all those wishes and merged them into 169 targets and say, if we reach these targets by 2030, then everybody seems like it's the world they want. And they make it such that if you work on any of those targets, it will not harm people working on any other targets. So it's self-reinforcing. And so just philosophy itself, I admit it is utopian to think that people working on economic growth, people working on environmental protection, and working on social progress can somehow magically reinforce each other's work. Of course, that is utopian thought. But on the other hand, it is what Immanuel Kant would say a regulative thought, also a regulative concept, in the sense that if we are to proceed as a unity on Earth, we have to hold certain patterns of thoughts in mind. It's not that they're constitutive, meaning that we can't actually do anything with them. They are just goals, right? They don't say how to reach those goals. But if we don't keep these in mind, the unity itself and the very possibility of breaking apart from the prisons, that is the individual sectors and individual movements become kind of impossible. So once we hold the image of, for example, as digital minister, I hold the image of the 1718 of enhancing availability of reliable data. I hold the image of 1717 of encouraging effective cross-sectoral partnerships, and 1706, which is if we make an innovation, we don't colonize other places in Earth with it. We open it up to share with everyone. Of course, we don't do 100% on any of this, but every day we make a little bit more contribution toward these goals, and these are regulative in nature. So I would say, of course, the formation, the image of imagination is utopian, but the nation of imagination, it is everyday action. And that is cooperative, to answer Shu Lea's question, is to hold similar thought patterns constitutive in mind, but then do actions that are within the spirit of the Constitution, but not the regulative idea, which are really just idea you can't really do anything about them. So it is like the old Kantian model of regulative ideas.
For once, even though, as I said the other day, I used to be a pathological utopist or utopian, but for once, I think I'm gonna play the other side, because I mean, you have to apologize me because I don't know well enough the context here as to be able to really discuss many of the issues that are probably worrying you here in the audience. But what I can tell you is that in the West, we are going through a double moment of, on one side, revolution. I would say that, yes, there is a revolution going on. That revolution not only happened in the, let's say, the 1960s, as we traditionally think, right? But also happening now in all the underground subaltern movements that are fighting precisely to have access to the technologies of government, to the technologies of knowledge production, to the technologies of inscription. So yes, this is a revolution happening today. You see it, like, I guess also here, but all around the world, in terms of, let's say, feminism, the sexual minorities, the colonized that are in a whole process of decolonization. So this is happening. But at the same time, there is also a counter-reform going on with a full movement towards much more conservative thinking, and even, I would say, at least in the West, in Europe, and in the US, neo-fascist thinking. Extremely nationalist, and extremely based on ideas of identity, blood, soil, like territory. And so, even though I totally hear you, Audrey, and I would love to share your utopian language, right? But when I see myself like that ending, you know, like finishing up poverty in the world is a goal, I would say, well, yes, but what do we understand by poverty, right? Is poverty defined in capitalist terms, or how is this defined in relation to the market? Can we, I mean, to go back to the discussion that we had today at the beginning, is that are we able to think even about what is a good life beyond the standards of neoliberal capitalism, right? Maybe, I don't know. I mean, at least, to tell you the truth, in the West, my doubts are like enormous, right? And I basically, I live between France and Spain, but I travel enormously, and I can't be optimistic about the situation, I have to say, right? So for me, I would say that we need a new grammar, because what health means today is been defined in very normative terms, right? And therefore, for instance, like if we think about, I'm just going to give you a very basic example, but if you think about having or being HIV positive in Taiwan today, this is almost a crime, right? It's like basically if you are HIV positive, you have to declare your status to the government, and therefore from that point on, your whole life and sexuality will be the object of surveillance, right? So, and this is for the public health, in benefit of the public health, right? So what does it mean to keep using the notion of health? The same with poverty or progress or, you know, advancement or transparency. Those notions, for me, are problematic, and I think that we need to collectively search for a new grammar to speak about the things that probably to speak even beyond the binary, not only in the sense of the binary male, female, homosexual, heterosexual, or even the binary code, but also the East and the West. I mean, these notions, the North and the South, do not mean anything anymore. And it's ridiculous that we keep using them. And even in the art world today, when we'll keep like talking about the global South, I'm like, what is this global South? I mean, the South is everywhere and it's nowhere because it's a colonial notion, right? So I refuse to keep talking about the global South as if, for instance, Taiwan would be within the global South and then whatever, right? This is from that point on, immediately there are like a series of consequences of that location, right? Whereas we know that cartographies are like also politically constructed, right? So I'm saying this because as much as I want to fully agree like with your good sense of Kantian, it's funny to bring Kant within this conversation because of those goals, right? But I want to agree to those good goals with why not. But as much as I want to do that, as a philosopher, and in this sense, even a curator, but much more as a philosopher, which is sometimes, I think that when you're doing poetry, there is a moment you can have, let's say, a moment of just like not caring too much.
Poetic
right?
license.
Exactly, right? Yeah, exactly. But as a philosopher, you have to take some responsibility, right? And then you realize that yes, the language that we are using to define what progress will be within the next 30 years or 20 years, if we're thinking about the 2030, I think has to be critically and extremely quickly revised if we don't want to promote something that myself I would call just like necropolitics, which, you know, is just like basically buying again into the politics of destruction of the planet and using of the human and non-human beings equally for the purpose of just production, right, and consumption.
I totally agree. And back in 2015, when the Sustainable Goals was first defined as the global goals, one of its so-called pinnacle of a philosophical change is that it stops talking about developing nations and developed nations. Which was a huge thing back in the Millennium Development Goals days. And that is, I think, a genuine grammar change, because it means that no matter where you are, as long as you are on the planet, you want to get there somewhere, regardless of developed or developing. But I do agree it's not going far enough. Many part of the SDGs are still defined, for example, in terms of the gross domestic product, which is now widely seen as a kind of bankrupt metric for any kind of progress whatsoever. So post-GDP well-being is actually a large part of the sustainable development discourse. Or even we can problematize this development word itself, right? Why not just sustain? Why development? What's development for, right? So these things, I do agree that we need to critically examine and redevelop until we don't just think in terms of development.
Well, I don't know if it's a good time to break into the question about... I don't know, maybe this is time to break into the question about the freedom. How would you transfer the possibility of virtual freedom in the limited practice of the modern mundanity of the masses? I do actually have a little doubt about virtual freedom. I do not particularly want to endorse virtually we do have more freedom than in reality. However, maybe this is a good question for us to get back to the title, what we set up to do, freedom, art, and democracy.
Yeah, and also, you know, they used, by they I mean this person who calls itself, quote, how would you translate a metaphor, question mark, unquote, which is a great name, by the way. They used translate / transfer. But that is a very interesting combination, because it's almost never together, right? If you translate, you're really bringing a copy, maybe an imperfect one, but you're bringing a copy. If you transfer, it kind of means that, you know, the original is gone, right? You make it to the other end, and it's not a copy, it's the same thing, right? And I think these represents two different views of freedom. I wouldn't even talk about virtual, of freedom, right? So one is that freedom is something that you need to fight for. It is never complete. You can get a translated version in you. Maybe you open up some possibility, and next generation will have more freedom. It's a very progressive view, which was true, I mean, certainly is true in Taiwan, where I still remember the martial law days when I was a young child. There's, of course, less freedom, and it's a objective fact, because when people publish something the rulers don't want to see, they get disappeared, right? So of course, we can objectively say there was less freedom of assembly, of publishing, of speech, of whatever, 30 years before compared to now. I think we can say that. But it also says the possibility of transfer, which means that it's kind of like a complete transfer, right? Once you have this freedom imbued in the flesh, then you completely free up, liberate, emancipates oneself. And I think these are two very different takes on freedom that will warrant different pathways into praxis. I don't even know the freedom they refer to in these two verbs are the same freedoms. So does Paul have something?
Well, no, I agree with you that that freedom is not something that is there as an object that we get, right? It's like suddenly, okay, we have something that we have to obtain that is freedom. I think that freedom has to be invented, right? We don't even know what is to be free. I think that that's the radical problem, is that we only know freedom within the limits of a very already constrained set of actions, right? So for instance, to go back to the example of transitioning, when I was a child, for myself, I couldn't even think about gender freedom because there was no framework in which being free in terms of gender could be thought, right? So there was just like a total impossibility, right? So I would say that yes, for me, freedom has to do precisely with the expansion of the possibilities of thinking, change and transformation, right? Much more than with acquire something that we already know what it is, right? But then what it's more worrying me about this question, and sometimes I wish we could have discussions with how would you translate a metaphor who should be around, maybe here. Oh, you're there. Okay, great. So
we have a spare microphone.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe you can, because it's also, I think it's fantastic to have the interface, for instance, for you to be able to have some inscription on the wall, but if you're here, then you can even more actively talk to us, right? So I'll talk to
please do. Is there a spare microphone, or should we take Shu Lea's?
I think you have a mic on the seat. Oh. Yes. No, it's not working.
Would you like to?
Yeah.
Maybe. You can help holding it. Yes.
Like this? All right. Yeah. Okay. First of all, thank you. I think this is the most progressive political and contemporary art interaction I ever seen in my life. Yeah.
Your life maybe not.
Well, maybe it's limited, my experience. Yeah. So, but this is like really something else. So yeah, actually, the idea was that my worries about this freedom that I see every day, for example, on my Facebook wall, and because I have a lot of progressive friends, and with my discussions with my friends, and then when I go out, for example, I live it in a wider angle or wider range from my comfort zone, there's a really different perspective. And I love the title. I really like what's happening over here. But I was wondering if there's like a methodology or some kind of measures to take all this brilliant content to that masses that actually sometimes when you actually try to talk about, even with these concepts like industrial revolution, cooperative action, they're like, what are you talking about? So yeah, like when we talk, for example, in social actions, and we see, for example, during the Civil War, this is an example, right? A lot of poets or artists try to put all this stuff that was in the cloud of the progressive movement and put it in the ground, for example, and going to the camp and going to the rural landscape. And what I see here is that in the virtual zones, we are actually building a lot of brilliant content that the challenge actually is to take it forward to the places that light have and it's just not there right now. So actually my question is, what do we do about this?
I can take the Facebook one because, yeah. So that brings us to a third kind of freedom, right? It's not just freedom to do something or freedom for some kind of people, but also freedom from something, negative freedom. I think that's the philosophical term. And so for your Facebook feed, I would like to invite you to try this for a bit. I've been working with this plugin in both mobile and desktop version for, I think, more than 2 years now. It's called, very simply, the News Feed Eradicator. And so it tears down the wall, the Facebook wall, so to speak, and replace it with some inspiring quote in this kind Adler, but you can get a different quote every time. So what it does is very simple. It takes the wall away and replace it with something inspiring. And the effect, very simply, is that it frees you from the algorithm meddling, manufactured addiction, the fear of missing out, and many other mental health hazards. But it does keep Facebook in its more intentional part. You can still use it like a blog, like to post something. You can use it like a search engine. You can search for a hashtag. You can visit your friend's profile. You can visit a Facebook page. You can watch a live stream. These are all good social functions because you make an action and you see the result happen. Right? But the wall is something else, right? You do nothing, and then things that fit your self-image that is done by a parasitic, symbiotic, since you're also paying, a symbiotic relation AI that's building for you, which is the filter bubble or whatever thing that you're describing. So I would suggest the simple fix that is the newsfeed eradicator that can just make this parasitic / symbiotic relationship go away, and it makes you much happier. At least it made me much happier. And now about bringing this kind of freedom to the masses, I would just use one particular example. It would just take a couple of seconds. So in Taiwan, we actually have a long history of social innovators who took something that looks like opposing forces, like the capitalistic regime and the social solidarity regime, into something that is collaborative and adds to each other. And there's many organizations operating for more than 20 years through co-ops, through foundations, through companies, and so on, that reinforces these forces. So I would just use one example because it's literally happening in my office in the Social Innovation Lab in Taiwan. It's called 天赋城市, or the Endowed City, which is working with people who are on wheelchairs and are usually street vendors selling, I don't know, chewing gums or tissue papers and so on, but working with them in a way through excellent visual assets drawn and designed by people with Down syndrome who understand the world through a geometric, not textual way. So because of their unique geometric composition, they get much more people's attention and also gets people into a more relaxed and collaborative mood, and using those regulative designs to address the issue of not knowing what the street vendors' financial flow is, of their limited interaction with the people on the street, and with their supply chain management, quote unquote, a very capitalistic term. And so basically the groups working on enabling them for better interaction, for redesigning the wheelchair to be a mobile station, to connect them to the city's services of fair trade and so on. And they began with nothing else than just a sketch. That's all they start with. And they began the sketch, and now they have a monitor here, and that can show advertisements, that can, through crowdfunding, share Wi-Fi. You can bring your phone for charging, sharing folded umbrellas, and so on. They are really operating in Ximending and the Social Innovation Lab right now. And so these are the kind of social innovations that I speak of, because first, it really is in the masses, right? You can't get more massive people than Ximending around here. And also, it brings a different imagination just by staying in front of these street vendors a little bit. You're already participating in the solidarity building movement by essentially not seeing them as quote-unquote vulnerable populations, but useful contributors, and not just useful but artful contributors to the streetscape. And there's many more cases like these where the initial intervention of speculative design, I would not say art because it's too positive a term, right? I mean, design is more positive in this case. Art may be dystopic, but speculative design always positive, and just showing the possibility space, and people just crowdfund and crowdsource themselves into this kind of atmosphere. So when I talk about the masses, I'm not talking abstractly. I mean, because of my office hour in the Social Innovation Lab. This is my office, by the way. So anyone can come and just talk to me, including rough sleepers, social workers who work with them, and so on, every Wednesday from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. And I also go to people. So when I talk about masses, I talk about specific interventions that brings speculative design into the masses, not the masses in abstract.
A very good time to open up a bit of questions from the floor.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Since we have an example.
Yeah.
And so.
Should someone like
somebody else follow?
Raise hand and microphone can be passed to you?
There's portable microphone next to every seat.
Oh really?
Yes.
Okay. Cool.
Great technology.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Otherwise, if there is no
always
question, for the time being, I just wanted to say that I would fully avoid using the notion of the masses, because basically this is a notion that implies that there is a look from the point of view of the state, and there is something that we cannot govern that is really like a mass, right? Like something like that. Whereas basically what I see with the today, much more than even if I think about, I mean, I'm from Spain and I grew up in the 80s, so immediately after the dictatorship in Spain, so I kind of have the same experience of basically like coming from martial law into something else, right? And my experience is that we are the first global generation, and in this sense, even if we have like 10 years of difference, but we are the first global generation who really have access in a major way to knowledge, whatever this is, and technologies, compared to, let's say, the generation of our parents or grandparents, right? So I think that the problem is that we keep looking at society in a very condescending way, like, oh, you know, these people that they are stupid, they have no idea. And even this is also happening within the museum, within the university, that we always have to, oh, when you're elaborating a project, they always tell you, no, you have to do it like much lower because people are so stupid, they will understand nothing. And you're like, what people are you talking about? I mean, these people are 100 times more sophisticated than ever before. And therefore, I think that this is what is really triggering this counter-reform that I was speaking before, is that no one before in history, we have been globally so ready as for a global planetary revolution. Never before. Now we could do it. And my question is the opposite to yours. My question is why we don't do it. Why we're not like, you know, like cooperating like crazy all together and saying like, hey, guys, I mean, we have to live differently. We cannot continue just like producing, consuming, trashing the world, destroying the environment. We immediately need to invent other technologies of living together that might not be directly turned into consumption and production. And therefore, that's my big question, like another language that is not the language even of sustainability, because it's to sustain what? I mean, there's nothing to sustain at this point, right? So it has to be like, for me, it has to be a language of transition, of transitioning from this model of economy, production, and planetary destruction into something else. And this can only be done collectively. And for that, we need to stop looking at at bodies, human or not human, organic or non-organic, as masses and to start look at them as all of them being like an element within a complex technology, right? Like basically, like it's a question a little bit like what Audrey was speaking about before when she was speaking about like how many different, let's say, either machines or instruments can connect or cables can be connected to each other, right? So we need this to use this possibility of multiple connection for something other than for consumption or production. And this is the moment of planetary revolution for me. But I mean, I hope that, you know, that some of you can join us.
I just want to say these persuasive electric vehicles are coming back to the Social Innovation Lab soon. They've visited twice already, and they're self-driving tricycles. And when we talk about AI here, I always talk about assistive intelligence, right? Not artificial, assistive intelligence. It's not just because assistive rhymes with collective, so that I can say assistive intelligence working with collective intelligence, but it actually really works this way because they're kind of slow, it doesn't harm anyone if they run into buildings, they're self-driving, it's all open source, you can change it to fit your need. If you go to Jianguo flower market, buy some flowers, put it into the pot, put it onto those PEVs, they will follow you like companion animals. And by the end of it, you can hop on one and it drives you home. Or if you don't like the red flash you use it to communicate emotion, you can change it to a face of a dog, why not? Or use other nonverbal means to communicate. But the whole point is that it is not a one-on-one relationship. It is not a single lab in the MIT or in any multinational manufacturing and mass producing these creatures. It is back to the idea of personal computing and social computing. Basically, everybody gets to modify and change and tweak the norms around these creatures so that they can fit better into the social fabric by us understanding also better from their perspective. And in this sense, they're not that different from other existing categories that we put on people, the identity politics that Paul just talked about. If we free them up, we just think about how to live together. And it is a far easier, actually, question to ask than how many representatives are we going to include today from carbon-based and silicon-based life forms, which will not work, actually, in this setting.
Well, the sense of you're actually forking a robot. And I think we also mentioned about forking the democracy. Want to kind of bring back, as what Paul was saying, the paradigm revolution. I think it's a very important term, actually. You know, whatever the frustration from the election today in Taiwan or on the right wing taking over in globally, I think. As an artist, who we are, curator, philosopher, cultural workers, I include everybody in this room. It's really back to what would the resistance means, particularly in the certain, you know, going back to the title, 3 times 3 times 6, the surveillance system that we live in. What would resistance mean today? I feel myself, as Paul said, I'm also an activist. I'm also a media activist. We are the code activist. Yes, so in this case, I think I'm always wondering about the kind of, you know, the masses, you know, again, back to the masses or the mundanity or the masses on the street holding the flag, holding the rainbow flag, particularly. For example, or the recent rainbow on the Facebook status report. These kind of, I think it's almost like what would be this kind of gesture? The gesture mean the gesture of the resistance. You know, in a certain way, I think we are coming back. To sort of more of a gesture of resistance, you know, I'm not so sure about the power, how to generate the power of resistance. You know, I think before when we are out on the street, we are counting the heads, and we counting the hats, how many people on the street. And we know all the time, by the time we got home and watched the TV, this was before the mobile phone time, that the television report, the media report would cut the masses into half, right? The police report also cut the mass into maybe 1/3. So in a certain way, what would these masses been? And again, we've been through the street movement, and we also through the digital disturbance on the net. And in terms, then I really want to question Paul's idea about very much to find a new grammar, the paradigm, and basically sort of reposition ourselves, isn't it? How do we reposition ourselves?
Before I thought it was a question, someone that had a question there, just in case, after you've been waiting for so long, after us,
like finally
talking about cooperation without letting you speak for 2 hours, I think it's too much.
Would you like to, because there's people watching live streaming, 可以把麦克风打开。对，就这样直播才听得到。
我英语能力也不是很好，好。
My English is not very good, so please help me in the translation. I think I'm speaking on behalf of the older generation, the more conservative group. In this election, Mr. Tang, may I call you Mr. Tang? You are one of the government officials. You talked about same-sex and the supporters for the gay community suffer from a setback in the referendum. What's your view on this? The LGBT community in Taiwan, you've touched upon this several times. And Ms. Chen, can you hear me? Ms. Chen talked about the rainbow and protest on the street. What's the significance of that? Well, I am from New Taipei. I'm not from Taipei. I come from Miaoli. I don't think I'm detached from today's society because I watch the news all the time. Are you getting the translation? And these issues are very important for our society. Freedom in Taiwan. Well, Taiwan is very much a free society. I don't think we're less free than the U.S., and perhaps we're freer than the U.S. So this referendum outcome, does that mean, does that show our position on the gay issues? Well, perhaps I don't know, but let me ask you this. President Chaya is an example of a female president who is not married. So, and even some people are suspicious that President Chaya is lesbian. And actually, before she was elected to the presidency, I learned from the news that a senior person in her party, the DPP, challenged her sexuality. And is that one of the reasons that the gay community are asking for their rights during her term. There were 5 proposals, 5 in the referendum. But I think these referendums related to gay issues and gay rights account for 1/3 of the proposals in the referendum. I want to ask Mr. Tang, could you talk more about this? Share with us your view, and how can we make our society better? And perhaps you can lobby for more votes in the next referendum. So I'm going to use the Chinese language to answer your question now. First of all, let's look at the fact. You mentioned that Taiwan is freer. Taiwan enjoys more freedom than the United States. Well, this is measurable. You can look at this civics monitor. When there is an event that's related to the freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and freedom of publishment, and then human rights organizations will report on this, and this person, this country gets less points, and then until the country makes some improvement. So if you look at this, in Asia, Taiwan is the only country that's free, and this is a fact. I'm not necessarily saying that we enjoy more freedom than Australia or some countries in North Africa, but at least in our region, we enjoy the highest degree of freedom, according to this website. And we're on par with Canada, better than the United States, according to this website. And we can agree on that. And the second piece of fact, as Shu Lea said earlier, in Facebook, you can see that many people are using rainbow in their Facebook pages. And you can also find people joining in this Together Stronger movement. Well, this is a massive scale movement after the referendum. This is a objective fact. We don't need to argue on this because this is a piece of fact. Taiwan enjoys high degree of freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. So we can say that the gay community, well, they're fighting for same-sex marriage, and whether or not it's marriage, that's a question. Some people say partner, some people say same-sex marriage, and some people say you don't need to use the word marriage, but that's a question of another debate. Let me share with you my feelings. When I was a child, my family told me that marriage is a social ceremony. You need to have a matchmaker, you need to have a banquet, you need to have a wedding. After that ceremony, you complete your marriage. And after that, you can go to the government household registration office. But that's after the ceremony. The ceremony is what the family would do. And then you go to the state to register. It's like when a person is born, you go to register afterwards. But then in 2007, we changed our legal framework. In 2007, starting from 2007, you go to the state to register. And no matter you have your wedding before or after, whether you have a wedding or not, these are not the conditions for your marriage. So if you get married after 2007, you don't need to follow the social ceremony. You just need to register with the government. And this is a Western idea, meaning that marriage is a right granted to you by the state, and it's like a protection granted to you by the state. But before 2007, marriage was like a family event. It's not a right or wrong question. It's the same word, marriage. But then when you ask people of different generations, they have different pictures on their mind. So now we have this referendum. In civil law, would you agree marriage, So, so when you see this, when you read marriage, the younger generation and the older generation might have different pictures on their mind. The younger generation might think about registration with the government, and older generation, they might think of the big wedding banquet. So this is just the beginning of a dialogue. I have many friends who just come out because of this referendum. Because of the referendum, they share with their family their experience of transgender or bisexual or the sex with same sex. And that was the beginning of a dialogue. We're not sure where it will go, but I think it's good to initiate such dialogue.
For today, it's a big pleasure an honor to be here today. Well, my question kind of concerns the idea of liberal democracy and also how the inclusion of people into families, having children and marriage. Also, just a small story, I was at a seminar organized by the United Nations University in Japan this summer, and many of the speakers, they spoke of getting rights, to minorities, because it was focused on sustainable development goals from a gender perspective. And my constant question was, how is it that it's so focused on getting these equal rights? I just spoke of marriage, and well, as in many countries today, there is a special treatment for people who are married. They get tax preferences, access to certain services, etc. Or that adoption, for example, people having children also get special treatment. So why is it often focused as getting the inclusions of certain minorities when it may rather be the case of, for example, not having marriage for a specific set of minorities, but rather perhaps not having the concept of marriage in society at all, that if people are free.
We can barely listen. Can you maybe use it?
Is it better now? Oh, okay, I guess.
I think that's the,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think the main idea I wanted to say is that it's often focused on getting, or the lectures in the seminar, I'm sorry, I'm not very familiar with this whole subject, but it's focused on getting equal access to marriage and having a family, etc., which is a very normative concept, I think. And I was wondering, why is there such a focus on getting people into these definitions instead of perhaps legally at least getting rid of or freeing people from the definition of marriage and preferential treatment, having a family, and giving the preferential treatment in society by law and the government to a certain set of people instead of, as in a liberal democracy, where we would have more equal rights to everyone, which is also, by the way, very strange, I think, that if the law states that all persons are equal, still legally there's been such a maltreatment and mistreatment and still continues today. And I'm wondering how the lawmakers are actually coping with this due to the fact that it should state that everyone should be treated equally, but they're obviously not. So I think my main question is I wonder why is the debate perhaps often focused on getting people into these definitions of marriage, family, and legal preferential treatment of certain people, and sometimes perhaps not much focused on perhaps removing these legal concepts and letting people define that between themselves, between their own contracts between persons, seeing them as individuals rather than as legal persons intervened in a very specific legal concept.
Okay. Paul, you want to pick up? Maybe we talk briefly on this, because I think you did talk about some of these issues in terms of marriage and the norm.
Yeah, maybe a way of asking to both questions at the same time. And I understand the worries of the person who spoke before, in the sense that I also went through the debate, for instance, in Europe, in France, in Spain, or in other places, and I heard also the complaints from not just the older generation, but sometimes. So I kind of used to hearing these remarks. For me, I think it's interesting to think about a very basic issue is like who is allowed to be a full citizen in a given society, right? And therefore, as long as we keep positions of subaltern citizenship, like basically, I would say bodies, because as long as not full citizenship has been granted to a body, you're not really fully human in a society, right? For instance, in a certain society, being human means having the right to get married and to celebrate your marriage with your family and give a big banquet, and this is part of a social ritual. And if you're not able to do that, therefore you're kind of excluded out of what it means to be human within that society. And I think that it's impossible to discriminate by law. This is what we're talking about when I mean, as much as I've been like saying before that myself, I think that the most radical thing to do would be abolishing the gender assignment at birth. I think that this is the most radical thing to do. But as long as we're not ready to have that debate, meanwhile, if you want, as a kind of tactical or strategic politics, we can also get into debates of more reform in terms of the law, which also can be, both discussions can happen at the same time and are happening at the same time, in fact. Like while some of the most radical, let's say, critical thinkers within gender, we are discussing like how to change the paradigm and how to change the framework, as long as defining how many genders we will be assigning, or maybe no gender. At the same time, there can be a debate that has to do with the reform within the law to create more spaces of full citizenship and avoid violence of a state or state violence and state discrimination. This is what I think that if we have like citizens that are allowed to get married and some that are not allowed to get married because of different reasons. It can be because they are like homosexual, transsexual, but also because they are like, let's say, as we said the other day, Down syndrome, or what happened, for instance, when you are in jail, to come back to the project that we've been discussing with, and we're working on towards the Venice Biennale with Shu Lea. When you are in prison, you have absolutely no rights. So you're really stripped of all your rights. Is this even legal? Maybe not, right? So, I mean, what are the conditions that grant full citizenship in a certain society, right? So, I think as long as we are still defining citizenship in terms of having access to marriage, then we need to say anybody can have access to marriage. Otherwise, we have to abolish marriage, right? If we are not doing that, then we agree that the state can discriminate. And for instance, what I think myself when we're having debates on feminism, for instance, is that we are operating already a kind of discrimination as soon as we assign gender at birth. Because that's the way in which we're saying, okay, male or female, and therefore, if it's female, let's throw it to the garbage, right? Because we know what globally, within the this patriarchal heterosexual regime means to be female, right? No matter that some people decide to be female, otherwise, but when you're like assigned female at birth, this is the reality. So I think that it's an issue of avoiding discrimination and changing the conditions that give access to citizenship, right? And those can be discussed, and I think it's a very good thing that Shu Lea is telling me to be short, but that we are discussing these things. I think this is the most important thing, and nothing can be solved in just one vote. It's voted, fine. It's lost, okay. If it's next time, whatever. Like let's keep talking about it, right?
It's very difficult for me to break your conversation. Particularly, it's a very emotional statement, and I think this talk about the gender and abolish gender at birth that related to the marriage system that we seem to be a certain concern has been such a big issue and is such a big grand issues, and in terms of what we have gone through today in all the topics we talk about, it's just such a, it's true, it's such a heavy issue. I do have, we also just lose time of 4:30. I don't know if the streaming have a particular time limit here, but I do maybe as an artist moderator, which moderating artist, I just want to maybe bring to the two last question, and actually this is some question I would not attempt to answer, but I think it seems as an artist, and people are still feeling as an artist, I think we all facing the issue about being an artist and not, you know, what would be the connection with the public, the general public, or our art not being understood by the general public, or someone posting that our conversation here today would never be understood by the general public. Nobody would look at our discussion video for more than 1 minute. So with that remark, I close this panel.
Thank you for the questions.
Thank you.
Let's give big thanks again to Shu Lea Cheang and also Preciado and Audrey Tang for bringing us such thought-provoking dialogue and also intense discussion, which is much related to our exhibition concept. Okay, so 谢谢大家今天来，那就是非常感谢3位郑淑丽，还有保罗普雷西亚多以及唐凤所带来的精彩对谈。那我们今天的活动就到此结束，谢谢大家的参与。
Thank you.
That's great. That's great. We had like whatever. If they don't want to watch, and then they have other things to do. That's fine. Yeah, I mean, we went through quite amazing questions. And of course, like how we debate right after the marriage.
That is really the...
Yeah, that's why I refer when I say people will be in a healing mood. Yeah.
Exactly. I think that...
No, but you're so patient. I was like so surprised. Even when the guys said like Mr. to you, I mean, like so kind.
Yeah, it's fine.
I know, but if they call me like nieces or something, they were like immediately saying, whatever. Yeah, you're right. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming.
Bueno, ahí me emocionó. Exacto. But this was great. No, my pleasure. No, it was great.
Yeah, come on.
I'm a graduate student who is studying mythology, and I'm going to write my dissertation about museum space and sociology.
Yes.
And I've read your book here. Oh,
wow.
I wonder if you can also read that.
I will be writing a small book on journalism. So can you tell me your name?